At SD Bullion, our everyday low prices are already lower than the big boys' so-called flash sales. One of the fastest growing bullion companies in the country, SD Bullion, just claimed a spot on the prestigious Inc. 500. So you have to ask yourself, why haven't you joined over 30,000 new customers who've recently made the switch to SD Bullion for the lowest gold, silver, and platinum bullion prices? To learn more, go to www.sdbullion.com and enjoy the lowest prices in the precious metals industry, period.
Hey everyone, this is Elijah Johnson with SilverDoctors.com, and with us today is James Corbett from the Corbett Report. James, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on.
All right, well, I'd first like to discuss about the breaking news. Just on Sunday, the FBI director, after about a week and a half ago, saying that he was reopening the investigation into Hillary Clinton's private email server, on Sunday announced that the FBI once again decided not to indict Hillary Clinton. Now, you reported about this on CorbettReport.com, and you were saying that, in your view, it may have been actually a smokescreen for a bigger scandal. Is that correct?
That's one of the aspects of what is happening here, I think, because there are a few different layers to this onion, one of which is that there is clearly internal dissent within the FBI. I think that is the most reasonable supposition from what we see going on at the surface. And the reports have been that there has been something of a rebellion going on within the FBI ever since Comey announced that they would not be pursuing criminal charges against Clinton on the particular case of the email server. Despite the fact of the gross negligence and carelessness, they declined to actually pursue criminal charges. And apparently from that point, there was a lot of commotion among the agents on the ground that had been working on the case, and even resignations coming from within the organization that was starting to put significant pressure on Comey. And so one of the aspects of why this was suddenly reopened so quickly after and in such a public manner, so quickly after the Wienergate scandal broke open, was a reflection of this internal struggle and probably Comey's attempt to try to maintain some sort of order over what was happening inside the organization. But I think another aspect of this was pointed out by Michel Chossudovsky in a recent interview that I conducted with him. He's the professor at the Center for Research on Globalization at globalresearch.ca, and he was pointing out that the strange timing of this unusual letter from Comey, which was a letter to Congress announcing that there would be a reopening of this supposedly, if not quite closed, at least abandoned investigation into Clinton's email server. The fact that he sent a letter to Congress announcing that they were going to reopen this investigation is highly unusual, highly unorthodox, and especially coming 10 days before a national election. Very, very strange. And Michel Chossudovsky points out that that letter came just 4 days after the Wall Street Journal reported that a Virginia governor with strong ties to the Clinton campaign had been implicated in a scandal involving a $500,000 donation, which can only really be interpreted as a bribe, via some organizations that he was linked with, to a woman who was running for a Virginia office, who had a husband who was a high-ranking FBI investigator who just happened to be the person who was appointed to run the Clinton investigation. So if you follow the money in this trail, it's basically from McAuliffe, the Virginia governor, who is an acknowledged Clinton ally, to the wife of someone who would be running the Clinton investigation in the FBI. And also that money, that $500,000, was not reported, apparently. So there's a lot of significant problems with that connection. This was reported in the Wall Street Journal just 4 days before Comey released the letter, and it was Chossudovsky's conclusion that there had been some amount of influence, of causal connection there, where the pressure on the FBI to to get some sort of indictment had increased significantly. Now, ultimately, what we've seen, of course, is with that scandal resolving, as it were, with Comey deciding that no, there would not be any further prosecution or criminal prosecution on the email server issue specifically, based on, at least on these new emails from the Anthony Weiner laptop. Nonetheless, there was some sort of influence that this Wall Street Journal article was having, and Chossudovsky ties that back to the financial and media conglomerate interests behind organizations like the Wall Street Journal, which of course is part of News Corp, which is tied into the Murdoch family, run by, of course, Rupert Murdoch himself, who is strongly tied into the Donald Trump campaign and has met with Trump on several occasions, and there is a documented connection there. So it seems quite obvious that there are media conglomerates like CNN and the Time Warner network of affiliates and various media mouthpieces that have no doubt been in the tank for the Clinton campaign. And it seems that there is some kickback from other media organizations. And I think that's a window into a broader understanding of this election, not so much as this particular candidate versus the other particular candidate, so much as it is as with every election, a kind of advanced auction sale on stolen goods, in which you have competing financial and power interests represented by different media conglomerates that are competing against each other for position in a future presidential administration.
You talked about how in a recent video that you put out about this very topic, how we're not actually seeing an election right now. We're actually seeing what you call a selection, where there's power struggles between powerful elites who are backing different sides of the already rigged process. Can you expand on this?
Well, the idea that the election itself is rigged is not something that has just come out of sui generis from Donald Trump's head. There is a lot of information and data to back this up. Bev Harris and other researchers have been working on this for years, and we've known since at least the 2004 campaign, we've known with documented testimony on the public record of various people who said that they were hired to actually create algorithms within the voting machine systems in order to flip an election in whichever direction that the people running the voting machines wanted the election to go. So we know that technology exists. We have the on record testimony in public court of people who were hired to do that particular vote rigging. This is not particularly new. So I think the idea of a stolen or rigged election process in a lot of different aspects, not just the voting machines, should not be particularly surprising, although it has gained a little bit of traction simply because one of the candidates has at least talked about the problem, or at least floated the idea. But I think it brings into perspective the broader underlying problem of the election selection process in general, which is not only all of the sort of election rigging that goes on, but also the fact that ultimately the contest revolves around two heavily vetted and selected individuals that represent a tiny sliver of a tiny sliver of a tiny sliver of a rarefied upper elite of the country. And does anyone really think, in their heart of hearts, that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are the two best qualified people in the United States to be the ones potentially leading the so-called free world over the next 4 to 8 years? I would think not, especially because we know from polling that these are the two least favorable candidates that have been put forward in modern electoral history. People have a higher unfavorability rating to both of these candidates than they ever have before. How have we arrived at this situation? It is because, of course, the voting process ultimately at base does not reflect the will of the people so much as it shapes the will of the people. And the people are given two candidates really as two different brands of toothpaste or two kinds of cola that represent a certain idea in the minds of the voter. And by the way, it comes with a policy package that may or may not be followed. And I think we only have to cast our mind back to 2008 to remember the way that Obama was marketed to the public as hope and change, hope and change. And this was thrust in the public's face, and everyone, or a very large proportion of the public, bought into that campaign. And ultimately ultimately ended up, quote unquote, buying the product by voting for Barack Obama and voting him into office. And I think if there's anyone left who is under any impression that the candidate that was campaigning in 2007, 2008 is the president that people ended up getting, I think they have been disabused of that notion quite thoroughly over the past 8 years, as we've seen. For example, the illegal wars of aggression started under the Bush regime continued. The illegal wiretapping and other invasions of personal privacy continued. The destruction of basic civil rights continued and amplified. The drone wars continued and amplified. All of these incredible abuses that started... well, not even started in the Bush regime, but were certainly helped along by the Bush regime, just continuing along with Obama. I think that shows the continuity of the agenda and the fact that we're not dealing with political parties per se. We're really dealing with an ensconced shadow government that operates, whether or not there's an R or a D after the name of the presidential candidate. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day, because there's so much institutional momentum behind the deep state that at the very least we can situate back to 1947 and the national security establishment, the formal creation of the national security establishment as we know it. That does not change no matter who you vote into office. So I think we have to be more wise about this. And of course, there are splits within the so-called elite, the powers that shouldn't be. There are divisions, and they're sometimes significant divisions. But ultimately, it becomes: do you want to choose the left brand of this particular deep state or the right brand of this particular deep state? And it seems that nothing particularly important changes. And every 4 to 8 years, there will be a candidate thrown out that gets at least one side or the other very excited about the possibility of real change. And then 4 to 8 years later, after that bird has soiled on the bird liner, they just clean the bird liner out of the cage, put in a new parrot, and all of a sudden we're expected to believe in the story once again. And it makes you wonder how many iterations of that the public can go through before they start to realize that the system is rigged in every sense, from the not only from the get-go, but really from even before the inception of the get-go.
So a lot of people would argue that Trump is different because he's not beholden to special interests. But in your view, is that not true? Is Trump actually just like other politicians, beholden to special interests?
Of course he is. Those special interests have a slightly different relationship to him because he is not involved in public office. But as a businessman, he certainly does have deep ties to a lot of the same sorts of networks that are lobbying government. They are also lobbying and connected in business. So, I mean, for example, one pretty obvious example that's easy to document is the Trump connections to Soros, who he is not only a personal friend of, but has wined and dined on various occasions, which of course people will point out is just part of good, what a good businessman has to do in order to survive. But it's interesting that any Soros connection to anyone else would be instantly denounced. But when it's to Trump, well, suddenly it's a different thing altogether. Or, for example, the fact that he is planning to ensconce Goldman Sachs members in his administration, the fact that he's met with war criminal Henry Kissinger for foreign policy advice, the fact that Rudy Giuliani, the butcher of New York on 9/11, who destroyed the crime scene of 9/11, is going to potentially be the Homeland Security Secretary in a Trump administration. The fact that he's surrounding himself with people like Newt Gingrich, who have been feeding the public the same nonsense for decades now, and which is supposedly the same nonsense that the people are rising up against in this big Republican insurrection. We could go on with his foreign policy advisors and other people who have the very same types of connections as Trump is and his supporters are supposedly railing against. But the proof will ultimately be in the pudding. If he does get into office, he's going to surround himself with the exact same types of people, and it's going to be business as usual in the White House. And in fact, business as usual might be the best way of putting it, because there's no doubt that it will be up to the highest bidders, and the same types of Goldman Sachs and Soros-connected people are going to be put into positions of power in the cabinet. And once that happens, I'm sure Trump supporters will find a way to rationalize that. But ultimately, for people in the reality-based community, they will see that there is absolutely nothing different about a Trump administration.
Now, you mentioned a little bit before about how Clinton and Trump are the most disliked candidates we've really ever had. And it's interesting how I think most people in America are voting not for the candidate they want, but against the candidate that they don't want. And you recently reported that you believe Americans are really being programmed to hate and to be outraged. Can you expand on this?
To be fair, I don't think this is a exclusively American phenomenon. I think it is certainly throughout the English-speaking world at this point, and I think throughout Europe as well. There has been and is a concerted push to whip up hatred and outrage as a form of political theater that is transforming the political landscape in ways that are documentable and verifiable, but I think also in ways that are worrying for what they portend for future political waves. And the most obvious example of that we've seen recently was the Brexit phenomenon, which for everything else that it represented, also in the minds, at any rate, of a lot of the media that was portraying this, represented a worrying shift toward a xenophobic public and the hatred that was on display by these Brexiteers who have hatreds for foreigners in their heart. The very fact that it's framed in this hatred and outrage at the outrage, I think is indicative of the political position we're in at this point in time, where it seems to be outrage culture has obviously been driving certainly, again, American public opinion for years now, and increasingly in Europe as well. And the backlash to that outrage culture is outrage at outrage culture. So every time there is an outrage about this or that, there are people who are outraged about the outrage, which is gaining more and more traction online in the online space, so that it's increasingly becoming a polarized choice between who do you hate more, or who do you hate the least, or how much hate do you have for this particular group, or which group will you identify with. And I think that is a very worrying political calculus, because it's obviously polarizing. It's obviously difficult to maintain a perspective apart from that. Once the hatred and outrage cycle gets going, you have to choose a side, because you can't be for this side because they're clearly crazy, and you can't be for them because they're stirring up hatred and outrage. And I think the ultimate strategy, or even if it is not a conscious strategy, the ultimate effect is divide and rule. Ultimately, you have a population that is at each other's throats, much more so than they are even thinking about people who are in the position to puppeteer outrages like this, who might be supporting these various ways in which people are being pumped into racial hatred and hatred of genders and hatred based on sexual preferences. Absolutely any and every identifiable difference between people is being used as an opportunity to create hatred and outrage and division in culture. And I think that's the exact opposite of what we need especially at this particular moment, when we are moving into such troubling economic times, and the collapse of an economic paradigm is troubling and difficult to live through at the best of times. And if one thinks about the 1930s and the Great Depression and the things that people had to live through at that time, imagine that type of, or that scale of financial hardship being faced by communities that are no longer communities, that are no longer groups of people who at least know each other and interact with each other and communicate with each other, but people who have spent most of their lives now buried in electronic devices of one form or another, avoiding their neighbors to the extent possible and fighting with them online. Imagine a financial collapse in that type of situation. It is that much more worrying to think about. So I think in the exact opposite tendency needs to be fostered at this point. The technologies that we have that are fostering this online outrage culture and the outrage backlash are the exact technologies that we should be using to create greater sense of community, to bring people together, virtually at first, but in reality, hopefully in the end, in order to create shared community structures that would be able to survive an economic cataclysm. If people are trading with each other at the local level, then it doesn't really matter fundamentally at the end of the day what happens on the macrocosmic scale, as long as that microcosm can maintain a community. Unless and until that occurs, I think we have to be very, very wary of the economic times that we're moving into.
Now, can you expand a little bit more on how people can work to avoid just hatred and outrage and instead work for the alternative?
Well, I think this comes down to the idea of community building, and that is it's easier said than done, certainly, but I think the value of that is easily demonstrable. And there are innovative and entrepreneurial ways that people are coming to find solutions through, for example, something that I talk about quite a bit, the peer-to-peer economy, with people interacting and finding ways to interact with and create communities where they didn't exist, or at least people didn't realize they existed before. And examples of this are like community exchanges, where online, for example, there are a number of apps and places now where people can set up, based on their geographical communities, they can set up exchanges where people will agree to share tools and things that they have that are one neighbor might have that other neighbors don't, that they don't really need on a daily basis, like a stepladder or a chainsaw or those types of implements. Those types of exchanges where people can go online and see, oh, the neighbor down the street has a chainsaw. I'm going to need that tomorrow. I'll see if I can get that from him. It seems like a small thing, but in fact, that is the creation of the kernel of what can be the types of community exchange, community sense, the presence and understanding of community that can be the tonic for this hatred and outrage and the othering of everyone, so that everyone is some sort of identifiable small group and unit that can be easily compartmentalized and hated for being other. Instead, we can bring people together to interact with things like that. And of course, other examples that are quite obvious in the so-called sharing economy are things like ride-sharing services are probably one of the best examples of this, of the kind of economic opportunity that exists there. But there are other ride-sharing platforms that are going one step further than that. There was one, for example, in Austin, Texas, that created a ride-sharing platform that doubled with a sharing economy charity that ended up delivering meals to the homeless via their ride-sharing service. And they ended up delivering 1,000 meals, the last time I checked, to the homeless. Those are the types of innovative ideas that are bringing people together in ways that are strange, not really even possible to think about before these types of technologies came along. But now that they're here, people are finding innovative ways to get people to connect and to get people to share and distribute things in ways that were not even conceivable before. That's I think, the bright spot. That's the thing that we can be aiming at, rather than simply devolving into these echo chambers of opinion online, where people are just shouting at each other, and more often than not just shouting at each other about how outraged they are about some other group on some other small niche on the internet.
All right. Well, James Corbett, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we let you go, did you want to share with the viewers any last thoughts you had and where they can find you online?
Well, once again, I think that the answer to these macrocosmic problems are not going to be found at the macrocosmic level that most people don't have access to. So I think it's about creating microcosmic communities and fostering interaction with those, and in ways that bring people together rather than drive wedges between them. That's really what my work is focused on, and hopefully driving at. So people can find out more about the work that I do at corbettreport.com. That's CORBETT report.com.
Once again, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me on.